You are standing at the edge of the camp. Behind you, the fire. Ahead of you, everything else. The people who raised you, who fed you, who taught you how to survive, have decided you are no longer one of them. This is not exile as a concept. This is exile as a sentence. And in the world of ancient humans, it was essentially a death warrant. This is what happened to people who were cast out. And by the end of this, you will understand why the fear of exile shaped human behavior in ways we are still living with today. Let's start with the biology of isolation, because isolation does something to the human body that most people do not fully appreciate. Humans are not solitary animals. We are not even group animals in the way that wolves or elephants are group animals. Humans are radically social. Our brains evolved inside groups. Our nervous systems were shaped by proximity to others. Our bodies release specific hormones in response to social connection and withhold them in response to isolation. When you are part of a group, your amygdala, the fear center of your brain, is measurably quieter. When you are alone and separated from the group, it activates. This is not a learned response. This is biology, and it goes back further than you might think. Anthropologists studying modern hunter-gatherer groups have found that isolated individuals die faster than you would expect from the environmental conditions alone. Not because they are less capable of survival, but because being alone triggers a physiological stress response that makes the body less efficient at thermoregulation, at wound healing, at fighting infection. Loneliness is not just an emotional state. Loneliness is a survival threat, and your body knows it. In ancient human societies, the group was not a comfort. The group was the difference between living and dying. A single human being, no matter how skilled, cannot reliably hunt large game, cannot defend territory effectively, cannot care for injured members, cannot survive a winter alone. The group was not optional. The group was the entire architecture of survival. And exile meant being removed from that architecture. Here's where the archaeology becomes genuinely dark. Evidence of exile in ancient human societies is difficult to detect directly because exile typically meant death, and death meant the remains were scattered or scavenged. What we find instead are skeletal remains showing signs of isolation. Individuals buried apart from the rest of the group. Individuals with healed injuries that would have been fatal without group support. Broken legs that healed at an angle. Infections that survived to skeleton. Malnutrition that should have been terminal but wasn't. These people lived through conditions that should have killed them, which means they had help. And then they didn't. In some Neolithic cemeteries, researchers have found individuals with severe handicaps or deformities buried in designated isolation areas separate from the main cemetery. Not in the communal graves. Not in the family clusters. Alone. In death as presumably they were in life. The care shown in the burial itself, the grave goods, the careful positioning, suggests they were still valued. But the isolation, the separation, the physical distance from everyone else. That was the message. You are not one of us. But exile was not just about spatial separation. It was about psychological erasure. In many traditional societies with good anthropological records, exiled individuals were described as ghosts while still alive. They could return to the edge of the camp to retrieve food left for them. But they could not approach, could not speak, could not participate in group activities. They were present and absent simultaneously, alive and dead at the same time. This is not metaphor. This is documented practice across multiple cultures. The person was still physically real. Socially, they had ceased to exist. The question that should be sitting in your mind is, why? Why not just kill them directly? Why engage in this elaborate performance of social death? The answer reveals something crucial about how ancient human groups functioned. Killing someone outright meant taking responsibility for their death. Exile meant the environment took responsibility. If an exiled person died of exposure, of predation, of starvation, that was not the group's doing. That was the world's doing. The group was merely enforcing the natural consequence of not belonging. This freed the community from the psychological burden of murder while achieving the same result. Exile was a way for groups to eliminate people without the moral weight of murder. And it worked because the biology of isolation did the killing for them. But there is another layer to this story, and it is darker still. Not all exile was punishment for crime or disability. In some societies, exile was used as a mechanism of social control. Women who violated reproductive norms, men who challenged authority, people whose minds worked differently, young people who questioned tradition. These were the candidates for exile. And the threat of exile was enough to keep most people compliant, because everyone understood what exile meant. Isolation meant death. Therefore, obedience meant survival. The threat of exile was one of the most powerful tools ancient societies had for enforcing conformity. Consider the psychological weight of this. Imagine living in a group of 50 people. These are the only 50 people you have ever known. Your entire understanding of the world, your language, your skills, your identity are all defined by membership in this specific group. Now imagine being told you are no longer part of it. You will not be killed. You will simply be excluded. You can walk to the edge of camp. You can see the fire. You can hear people talking, but you cannot join them. You cannot eat at the communal meal, cannot participate in hunts, cannot sleep in the shelter, cannot be part of decisions that affect the group. You are a ghost haunting your own society. The psychological breakdown from this would be catastrophic, and it would be catastrophic in ways that a quick, clean death would not be. The extended isolation, the social death while remaining biologically alive, the constant awareness of the group just beyond reach. These create a suffering that lingers. And that lingering suffering serves a purpose. It is a warning. It is a demonstration of power. It is a way for the group to say, this is what happens when you stop belonging. But here is the most interesting part of this story. Some exiled people survived. Not many, but some. The archaeological record shows evidence of individuals living on the margins of societies, scavenging at the edges, raiding camps at night, developing alternative survival strategies. And in rare cases, these exiled individuals formed their own groups. Small, fragile bands of the rejected who banded together precisely because they had nothing else. These groups were typically short-lived, but they existed, which suggests that the threat of exile was powerful enough to keep most people compliant, but not universally fatal, which means the threat itself was the point. Exile as a social technology worked by being catastrophically dangerous to most people and just barely survivable for some. The threat was credible because the danger was real. But the existence of rare survivors meant that exile was technically not a guaranteed death sentence. It was a conditional one. You might survive, but you probably would not. And that uncertainty was paralyzing. There is also the question of what exile meant for groups that were themselves isolated. Small bands of 50 or fewer humans scattered across continents. When you exile someone from a band that size, you are not exiling them to a larger society. You are exiling them to absolute wilderness with no other humans within potentially hundreds of kilometers. The difference between exile from a band of 50 and exile from a city of thousands is enormous. But the principle is the same. Belonging is survival. Non-belonging is death. Here is what makes this story relevant to modern humans. Your brain still contains the neural architecture that evolved inside small groups, where exile meant death. The fear of social rejection is not irrational. It is ancient. When you experience the anxiety of social judgment, when you modify your behavior to stay acceptable to a group, when you feel the panic of being left out, you are experiencing systems that evolved specifically to prevent exile. These systems kept your ancestors alive. They do not necessarily serve you well in the modern world. But they are not new. They are not modern inventions. They are old enough to be biological. Studies of modern humans have found that the pain of social rejection activates the same brain regions as physical pain. Rejection hurts. It hurts in the same way a wound hurts. This is not metaphorical. This is neurological. And it is an echo of something ancient. Because for most of human history, social rejection meant physical death was coming. The brain learned to experience rejection as a threat to survival itself. And that learning is still coded into you. There is also the phenomenon of conformity pressure. In virtually every human group ever studied, members modify their behavior to stay acceptable. They suppress opinions they think others will reject. They perform roles they do not authentically identify with. They accept group decisions they disagree with rather than risking exile. Psychologists studying this have found that people will publicly agree with obviously false statements if the group insists on it. Not because they are stupid, but because the threat of rejection is stronger than the commitment to truth. The ancient fear of exile is still running the show. The modern manifestation of exile is more complex because it is not absolute. Social media has created a form of exile that is partial, reversible, and public. You can be exiled from a community online while remaining physically safe. You can be exiled from a professional network while maintaining other group memberships. The stakes are lower, but the fear is the same, because the underlying neural system does not know that physical death is unlikely. It only knows that belonging is threatened. Here is the uncomfortable part of this story that most people do not want to hear. The fear of exile also drives cruelty toward others. When group membership is scarce and exile is credible, group members often strengthen their positions by helping to exile others. Scapegoating is not a new phenomenon. Witch hunts, heresy trials, inquisitions, genocides, these are modern forms of ancient exile machinery. Find someone who does not belong. Exclude them. Make their expulsion so complete and public that no one will question it. And by doing so, the group reinforces its own cohesion. The outsider is sacrificed to strengthen the inside. This is not evil in the modern sense. This is engineering. Groups that effectively created enemies and exiled them were more cohesive. More cohesive groups survived better. Therefore, the ability to create scapegoats and enforce exile became an adaptive trait, which means cruelty toward outsiders is not accidental to human social organization. It is central to it. We are capable of extraordinary compassion toward people inside the group, and we are capable of extraordinary cruelty toward people outside it. And the shift between those states can happen almost instantaneously. The next time you feel the panic of being left out of a group, the next time you find yourself suppressing an opinion to stay acceptable, the next time you participate in the exclusion of someone from a community, you are participating in something that goes back hundreds of thousands of years. You are not being rational. You are being ancient. Your body is responding to threats that no longer exist in the form they used to exist. But the response is real. The fear is real, and it drives behaviors that shape your life every single day. Ancient humans who were exiled faced death. Modern humans are rarely exiled in ways that are physically fatal, but the fear of exile is still running inside your nervous system, still shaping your choices, still pushing you toward conformity, still making you afraid of being the person who stands alone. And the only way out of that fear is to understand where it comes from, not just intellectually, but in the deep places where ancient survival instincts still live. Your ancestors survived because they belonged, and because they were terrified of not belonging. That terror is your inheritance, and it is not something you can think away. It is something you have to learn to live with while understanding that it is not truth. It is just old biology running in a body that no longer needs it the way it once did.